into town today, I managed to find my way to the Dakota Cafe and got some coffee there. I was directed there by the mountain shop in town. And there was an interesting quote on the wall in the cafe, a John Wayne quote. And, you know, John Wayne and I have a lot in common, because if you've seen Westerns, you've basically been looking at the Rocky Mountain Floristic region. And so John Wayne and I have both spent a lot of time working in the same area. And the quote was something that I subscribe to, which is, "A man's gotta do what a man's gotta do." I gotta pick flowers. That's what I do. Maybe his was a little different. But that's what I want to talk to you about today. This is a picture of Glacier National Park up in the Alpine there. If you haven't been there, you gotta go there, especially before the glaciers are all gone. I'd just like to start off also by noting and thanking my funding source, which has generally been the National Science Foundation, as well as getting gear from Black Diamond, who've really helped us out a lot. So this is one image of the Rocky Mountain Floristic region. And here is another image of the Rocky Mountain Floristic region. Does anyone have any idea where this is? Another place, if you haven't been there, you gotta go. This is on Haida Gwaii, the islands formerly called Queen Charlotte Islands. And this is another view of what the Alpine looks like, but primarily the Rocky Mountain Floristic region. And so when you think about this region, there's a lot of, in addition to making Westerns, important aspects of it. One of them that seems to be foremost is that the mountains across this area drive the climate in a large part for North America. And I'll show you how that happens. The area is very important for having glaciers, having a lot of snow, retaining water. Jenny and I were talking about how snowpack influences the agriculture in the area, and that's certainly across the west, and there's going to be large changes because of that. This also leads into all the important fisheries of our region. But the Rocky Mountain Floristic region for North America is known as being an incredibly biologically diverse area. A huge amount of diversity in comparison to other areas. And what you're seeing here, all in the background, has been important economically as well as floristically, which is, in the New World, it's the highest region for the diversity of coniferous plants, like all those trees that you see in the background there. But if you ask my daughter, she will tell you that this is why it is important. Vaccinium, blueberries. And so this is my field assistant for a lot of the time. And but what we're here to talk about is these guys right here, which are these alpine plants that are precariously perched above this sea of conifers generally. And so you have these really isolated populations on these, basically this archipelago of sky islands that are strewn across western North America. And we're going to look at them today. So what I'd like to do in the course of this talk is give you an introduction to this region. You've seen a couple of pictures, but you still may not have any idea what it is. And then really go into the what the alpine flora is, the history of it, as well as following that, the evolution of that, and what we can learn from the history and how these plants have evolved, and hopefully help inform us about what might come down the pipe for them as we experience warming and changes in climate. This image again is set, this is in Jasper National Park in Alberta, and this is set to just continually remind us that in this case, here's the Alpine, right? So it's just these islands that are out there within the Rocky Mountain Floristic region, which is basically all these conifers, which makes it difficult for them, the alpine plants, to have populations that are more or less connected. So first we'll start off with this introduction to the region. All right, so here is everything in color falls within the Rocky Mountain Floristic region. All right, so this is a huge area. It's basically the Cordillera of Western North America. This is the Southern Rockies down here, Colorado and New Mexico. This is the Wyoming Basin, or the Continental Divide Basin, a low area. We're going to talk about the importance of that. And then the Rockies extending all the way up into northern British Columbia. In addition, there's another Cordillera that runs along the coast. It's called the Cascade Sierra Range, but basically the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, and then up into the Coast Range. And it goes all the way out here to parts of Kodiak Island. And just to note, the Californians would take this as part of their own floristic province, the California floristic province. And there's some good reasons to do that, because it is quite different from the other areas. But pretty much, if it's in the mountains, you've got the Rocky Mountain floristic region. All right, so to zoom in a little bit closer just into that region there, there's a lot of interesting things that are going on. We have this really long span of these parallel mountain ranges. That impacts the distribution of plants dramatically, because unlike pretty much anywhere else in the world other than South America, the mountains run north and south for a very long region of latitude. And that makes it so that when there's times of climate flux, which climate is continually fluxing, they can kind of migrate north and south along that Cordillera as opposed to getting stuck on an east-west transect of mountains. As we mentioned, highest diversity of conifers in the New World. Deciduous trees only play a minor part, and unlike in the Northeast. And there's a considerable amount of alpine tundra, and that's what we're here to talk about today. In addition, there are 40 endemic genera of plants, not just alpine plants, but plants in general across this. Most of them occur on the west here. We'll talk about that as opposed to in the interior. But it's important centers of diversity for a number of those genera: Arnica, Castanea, Erigeron, and Lamaceae. Neighboring this province, or this floristic region, are other provinces and regions. So the circumboreal region with the Canadian provinces up here, this is basically your boreal forests. And so much lower generally in elevation, but really dominated by boreal trees. Out to the east, you have the Prairies province, which is part of the North Atlantic region. So low elevation, much drier area, good for crops and things like that, which is pretty much what's there now. And then the Madrian region to the south, which includes the Great Basin, and that area is a much drier habitat. And so all these different neighboring regions and provinces influence the flora within the Rocky Mountain region. And I was saying that this region is important climatically. This is basically the patterns of how you get precipitation in the west. So a lot of it comes down from the Arctic. You have these different currents that are going on in the Pacific, but then you have air currents that are coming down from the Arctic. Most things are moving west, and so basically that sets up a gradient of dumping precipitation and then less precipitation as you get out here. In addition, you get tropical systems moving into the southern Rockies, and so that is a completely different system, and we'll see that that region is very different floristically than the rest of the area. And so what that does is leads to this sort of precipitation pattern, where we have the blue being very wet, as we know, well, at least I know in Bellingham. You guys know less of that. So thank you for bringing me over to the sunshine. And then in the Rockies, those blues are not as dramatic. There's precipitation out there, but less so because a lot of it has already been dumped on Mount Olympus or something like that. So wetter coastal mountains, drier interior, and that leads to two floristic provinces within this floristic region, the Rocky Mountain floristic region. The Vancouverian and then the Rocky Mountain. And so we're sitting in this Vancouverian floristic province. And so basically, the color codes here are as blue are the Vancouverian area, and then this green-yellow stuff would be the Rocky Mountain province within this greater region. And so just some quick stats about this: 3,500 indigenous plants within the Vancouverian. There are some, as we said, it's not a large component, but important broadleaf trees, as well as a number of shrubs. 500 to 600 endemic species in this. And as I pointed out before, most of the endemics are in the Vancouverian portion of the Rocky Mountain region as opposed to that Rocky Mountain province. As we'll see, both of these regions are very important or are marked by this vertical zonation. So along the Vancouverian, it goes from the temperate rainforest all the way up to the Alpine. but we see a similar pattern in the Rockies. It's about the same number of species in the Rockies, maybe a little more, 5 endemic genera, and then here's some breakdowns of where we see a number of different taxa. There hasn't been a good compilation for either of these provinces as far as the statistics of how many different species there are across the whole thing, as opposed to how they're related from one mountain block to the next. And so here's some of the works that have been done. But what we see is in the Rockies, there's a lot of diversity down here and less so up here. We'll get into why that is. Okay, so another thing that happens, difference between the Vancouverian and the Rocky Mountain Floristic provinces, is where the Alpine is, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so basically, going from left to right on both of these is going from south to north. So in the south, the elevation is higher for the Alpine, and then as you go north, the elevation is lower. So it's going from about 2,200 meters to 1,000 meters, going from about 3,000 meters down to about 2,000 meters. And so this is largely driven by the climate, the precipitation. And just if you're unaware, recently there's been a publication, an awesome field guide for alpine plants from basically, I think it's from Wyoming up through Alaska, and that's by Pojar and McKinnon. And so it's an excellent source for getting out there and seeing what is out there. So if we look at the Alpine is everything in this sort of fuchsia color here, and this really highlights that this is really a bunch of islands that are out there. It's much more discontinuous than the Rocky Mountain Floristic region overall, the lower elevation habitats. And that has a huge play in the diversity that's in the region, as well as the opportunities for plants to respond to climate changes and move about the place. And so the Alpine is typically defined basically as land above tree line. It has, it's cold most of the year, the average temperature being 0 to 4 degrees centigrade. It's coupled with a bunch of wind and snow, so alpine plants have to have a number of adaptations to deal with that. And then also it has this really short, cold growing season where precipitation may not be all that available. And that's really what keeps the conifers out of the area. What we see in general, there's a real general trend going from north to south, in that up north it is dominated by circumboreal or circumpolar species, so Arctic taxa. And then they decrease moving southwards, such that down in the southern portions, they're not very well represented. And actually you have a bunch of taxa that are endemic to the southern Rocky Mountains or to the Sierra Nevada that are derived from the lower elevation environments or forests that are there. Okay, so then just to highlight the topographic heterogeneity of this region and how populations can become really isolated. This is just a figure going from south to north, just in the continental U.S. Rocky Mountains. And so here's the Southern Rockies, and then here's Glacier National Park. There's an area in between that's called the Continental Divide Basin, or the Wyoming Basin. And I was there just a couple of years ago. It's amazing. You go from this to this, and then back to that. And you can see how that would be an incredible barrier to dispersal for any of these high elevation plants. It's terribly dry and low elevation. And so the seeds would have to basically make this big jump, which is basically about 2 degrees of latitude. And so the Southern Rockies end up being very isolated from the rest of the area. So if we take a couple of transects along the coast and then along the interior, going from south up to north. Here's my dad up on near the summit of Mount Whitney in the Sierra Nevada, the highest point in the continental U.S. You can see that this place is pretty dry looking. Same thing, this is down in the Sierra Blanca of New Mexico, pretty dry areas. And then as you move northwards, here's Mount Baker, and this is Sawtooth Lake up in Idaho. You're getting into a much wetter area, much wetter habitat, much more precipitation, presence of glaciers. And then as you move further northward, it's really dominated by higher precipitation. And so these things are going to influence the taxa that are there This again is just another shot in Glacier National Park, and then this one is up in sort of central BC. And so, depending on where you are, the habitat is very different, the climate is very different, the environmental stresses for the taxa are very different. And so, when we look at those plants that are there, we can see that the habitat they use is not sort of universal, but is broken up into all these different types. The majority of them are on fell fields. I'll show you what a picture of that is, but basically it's a rocky field. And then about the same amount are in meadows. So you can probably have an image of an alpine meadow in your head. And then it kind of deteriorates down to only very few are colonizing willow or heath or gravel bars or frost patterns or at tree limit or something like that. And only a tiny, tiny bit are cosmopolitan, meaning they occur in most or all of these different habitats. And so this is what those look like. So this would be a meadow. That's another shot from Glacier National Park. Here's a fell field. You can see all these rocks in the background there. This is a talus slope, and so it's been heavily colonized by a number of taxa. And then you have these marshes and ponds and bogs and things like that that are out there, just to show you a little bit of the variation in habitats that the alpine plants can choose among evolutionarily. And so this picture is from the Olympic National Park, but what I want to get into now is actually looking at what the flora is of this region and seeing what some of the common denominators are. And so if we take a slice of the flora, basically it's dominated by herbaceous flowering plants. And then there are grasses and sedges and rushes. There are fewer shrubs, and then there's some ferns, and then there are conifers that occur in the alpine. This would be typically in your krummholz, so these weathered dwarfen trees that are up there. But also there's a juniper that commonly occurs in the alpine. But again, dominated by the pretty flowers. And so if we want to look and see what the diversity is of those plants, again, it's not even across. Most of them are in the Asteraceae, that's the sunflower family, and then the Poaceae, the grasses, and Cyperaceae, the sedges. The Rocky Mountains has a huge amount of sedges. The Brassicaceae, the mustards, I've got Scrofulariaceae here in sort of quotes because really that's been broken up into a number of families. For our purposes, it would be the Plantaginaceae and the Oroboncaceae, things like Indian paintbrush and stuff like that. Another pretty frequent family is the Saxifragaceae, which is one that I work on. Willows, roses, peas, there's your vacciniums and things like that, and on down. And then there's a number of them that I don't have listed here because maybe there's only one or so species of orchid that occur in the alpine. But the diversity is spans a number of different families, but definitely not evenly so. And so here's what some of those are. Looking at them, the Asteraceae, we've got the old man of the mountains here. This is a southern Rocky Mountain endemic. We've got ice grass. We've got the sedges, Eriophorum, and then Brassicaceae. Penstemons would be in the Plantaginaceae. This is a common one, Penstemon davidsonii here. Saxifragaceae. This is a little Arctic willow. This is Leutkea, which is a small rose that occurs at high elevations throughout our area. So these would be the top 8 families that you would see in the alpine. Not these individual species, but the representative of those families. Okay, so how is diversity divided up amongst these different mountain blocks that are out there? This is again the Vancouverian area. This is the Rocky Mountain province. This one's split up much more so because there's a bunch of little isolated islands and peninsulas out here where diversity has been examined. There's a lot of endemism. The Rocky Mountains aren't split up as much because basically the taxa span broader regions there. But one thing that we can see, even in a little area like the Olympic Peninsula, the Alpine there, has a huge chunk of, this is basically the proportion of the Rocky Mountain flora diversity that's found in the Olympic Peninsula. So within the Sierra Nevada, almost half of the alpine plants are found there. Not that they're restricted to there, but it harbors a ton of that, and the same thing for the southern Rocky Mountains. And again, this goes back to because there's this influence of Arctic plants up north, so almost everything shares those, and then as you go down south, they're more endemic to those southern regions. And if we look at that, then there's a number of them that are circumpolar and occur just within North America, and again, those are those Arctic plants. And then a lot of them occur throughout this region in western North America. The southern Rockies and the Sierra Nevada harbor huge chunks of that diversity, whereas our region is much smaller, but has a lot of endemism as well. And so where are those endemic plants located? In the southern Rockies, 38% of the alpine plants that occur in the southern Rockies are endemic to the southern Rockies. That's an amazing number. Basically, a third of the plants that are there only occur there. Whereas about 9% occur out on of the alpine flora on the Olympic Peninsula is endemic to that region. But what you can see is along the west coast, in the Vancouverian area, there's a lot of endemics in comparison to this area. And that's primarily because of a lot of glaciation has occurred there.
Yeah, so I have a question. It looks like our area has a pretty big chunk too, because we're kind of central Washington in that dark blue.
Yeah, so this 7 here, that would be for the entire Cascades. So it's the North Cascades and Southern Cascades, but both of them, both the Northern and Southern Cascades harbor a good amount of endemic species. The Southern Cascades a little bit more. But yeah, we definitely have quite a few endemics here. And a lot of this is because of the climate patterns, the amount of isolation, the lack of glaciation, and because it's a much more amenable habitat than out here, which is a lot drier. Yeah, so we have a good amount, for sure. We're sort of known for that, which is nice. And so these are some of these taxa. Saxifraga taylori only occurs on the Olympic Peninsula and right there on Vancouver Island. Viola fletii only occurs on the Olympic, or that was Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island. Viola fletii only on the Olympic Peninsula and part of Vancouver Island. And then this Ivesia only in the Sierras. Rhodiola rhodantha only in the southern Rockies, and so on. And I don't know if there are any, but I didn't want to put a 0 for this sort of central mountains in British Columbia, but I couldn't really find that there are any, but I don't want to discount it completely because there's probably something there. Okay, so that's kind of setting the stage for what we have. Going forward then is looking at the history. So what are the processes that have given rise to these patterns of diversity? And one thing to bear in mind in looking at this stuff is typically we think of alpine plants as being very fragile, and they are fragile underfoot. So bear in mind that if you're out there hiking, you can destroy an area. If you go up to Heather Meadows by Mount Baker or something like that, up to Artist Point, it's just tracked over because so many people go there, trampled, and the plants can't come back, right? And so in that sense, alpine plants are fragile, but in the sense of their history and dealing with climate, they're not so fragile. But so basically, where did these plants in our region come from? Most of them had their origin in Central Asia, most likely, and then made their way over here, probably in the late Pleistocene, got into the Rockies, but not the Cascades at that point. And around that same time period, we had this circum-Arctic belt in the north. So a circumpolar Arctic flora had developed. And so it's a relatively young flora in comparison to other environments. And so an example of that is this Saxifraga oppositifolia, which gets into our area, gets down into, I don't think it gets down into the southern Rockies or the Sierras, but pretty much everywhere else, but not commonly. And the inference for this is basically what people did is they went all around. This is a circumpolar species. They went all around the Arctic, collected samples, did some genetic work. This is in the year 2000. So using some primarily chloroplast regions, and then tried to track and figure out where this thing came from, how it moved across the landscape. And so in doing that, that's the field of phylogeography, basically taking a phylogeny and putting it on a geographic map and seeing what can you infer from that pattern. And what they were able to infer based on the prevalence of where these different haplotypes or unique sequence data are is that this thing came over to North America across this region where the Bering Sea is, a region called Beringia, and then moved down south along the Cordillera, and that's why we see it here. So this one is something that got here, as I was saying, is the dominant mode by means of coming from Central Asia, the highlands there. Another option exhibited by Vaccinium here is that it actually was derived in this Beringia area. So Beringia was a place that was not glaciated during the ice ages. It was ice-free. It's known as a refugium, a place of stable habitat where mastodons were able to live, people were able to live, and plants were able to live, and then they were isolated there for glacial periods and then spread out from there. And so Vaccinium uliginosum is one such taxa that then spread eastward into North America and westward into Russia and then around the globe. And so this again came from outside of our region. And so I'll give you some other examples as we go on here, but then to look at this, how is that possible is we have to look at the climate history. And so this is a snapshot of the last 600,000 years going forward in time to today, which actually on this side it would be cold. On this, if the graph is over here, it's a warm period, so we're actually more out here now. But basically what we can see is these temperature variation is the cyclical pattern, and these are known as the climate cycles, the ice ages, things like that. And if we look at a map, a little model here of what that means for high elevation taxa in our region, this would be the Arctic tundra, these would be the Alpine tundra down south. This is where the ice sheets would have been across Canada. During a cold period, the north and the south are isolated, but cold is a good period because Alpine taxa could be down low. During a warm period, Alpine taxa move upslope. They're isolated from the northern area because of that. And then also they might go extinct, and that's what that little X means. If they can't go up high enough, the mountain isn't high enough, then they're just lost. And then as it cools again, they'll go down slope and mix together. And so historically, this is the pattern that we've seen, this upslope, downslope, and north-south migration associated with the climate record. And so if we revisit this figure of the Alpine, all this blue stuff is where the ice would have been during the last glacial maximum. About 21,000 years ago. It was actually at its major extent for our area only about 13,500 years ago. But basically, the northern half of the Rocky Mountain Floristic region was under ice. So that's why we see a lower diversity up here, why there's a lower number of endemic taxa, because there just was no place to live. There's some evidence that there were potential nunataks, which is a mountaintop that's poking out above the ice where taxa could have persisted. And there's a number of other potential refugia other than this Beringia that would have been over here. But pretty much this whole region was covered with ice. So for the Rocky Mountain Floristic region, the flora there, it persisted primarily down here and along the coast. So unlike lower elevation taxa, they were isolated in refugia, these stable climatic environmental areas during glacial periods, but then they were also isolated in sky islands atop mountains during warm periods. So it's a continual history of isolation. So what people have tried to do is look at all the potential taxa that have been studied, and this was back in 2005, and try to infer and test ideas of where those refugia could have been. And so one idea is up in Beringia here, there could have been a refugium. Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte Islands out here could have been a refugium. Maybe in the northern Rockies, down in the southern Rockies or the Klamath area, and then all these other potential areas. When they did this, this middle Rockies one wasn't supported by the evidence. So there's no real strong evidence that says there was a refugium for a lot of taxa at that point. But these other ones were supported. And then when people have revisited this and looked at it in more detail, we're finding that there are actually a lot of pockets where taxa could have persisted. So up in Thuringia, again, this part of the map up here, and then right here is along the coast, the Alexander Archipelago, and the Haida Gwaii. And then if you go further down, south of where those ice sheets would have been, would be Vancouver Island, the Olympic Peninsula, the Blue Mountains, the Middle Rockies, the Yellowstone area, the Klamath and Siskiyous, and then off the map here would be the Southern Rockies. So a lot of potential refugia where plants would have been, or organisms would have been isolated. And what this shows is simply the movement, the potential routes where those taxa could have moved northward, coming from the islands to the mainland, coming down from the south, from the north, and everything like that. And again, to keep in mind, when we look at the alpine, here's the warm period like now. It would have been much lower during a glacial period. So glacial periods were really when the plants had it good. Populations were big, there was a lot of landscape, they were connected, populations could expand, plants could migrate, colonize everywhere. Right now is when the times are difficult. Population sizes are reduced, they're isolated on tops of mountains, and that scenario is most likely going to get worse. And so that kind of is what's given rise to this point. What I want to look at now is the evolution of how this alpine flora has changed. And so some themes that we see is that the flora of different mountain regions developed differently. They all had to deal with whatever the local or regional climatic and physical factors were. They were derived not only from this sort of Arctic or Central Asian flora, but also from the local flora at lower elevations, and also developed in isolation. Becoming isolated, they speciated. And when we look across mountain blocks, there's limited similarity. Like the Southern Rocky Mountains is very different from the plants that are in the alpine of the Sierra Nevada, as well as other areas. Some of them, though, that are common to all regions are really widespread Arctic taxa, like Oxyria, for instance. So one group that I've been interested in is this Saxifraga section bronchiales. This is a map of where different sort of subgroups or clades occur. We'll be mostly interested in what's going on here, but I put this big map up here. There's about 14 different species in this section, and they span from North America across Thuringia into Siberia and down into the islands of Japan. And there's a lot of endemism, and it appears that this group was recently derived. This is one that hopefully you've seen, but if you haven't, get up to the mountains and find it. Saxifraga Austra Montana, otherwise potentially known as bronchialis, subspecies or variety Austra Montana, but our research shows that it actually should go back to its original specific epithet. It's Saxifraga is known as the rock breakers or stone breakers. One idea is because they do this, they get into little cracks and they bust them open. The other idea is because it's good for, I think, curing kidney stones or something like that. But I prefer the plants that are getting in there, tearing open rocks and everything like that. But they have this amazing cushion plant morphology, and I like to take the time to look at these small flowers and just see how absolutely beautiful they are up close. And so what our phylogeny for this group shows is that the ones that are most ancestral in this clade are these southern ones, Austra Montana, and then Taylori is the one that occurs on Haida Gwaii, and then that's this one here, and then there appears to be a migration across Thuringia. This is Funstonii that occurs on both sides of the Bering Sea, and then over here's an example from Russia is Sterbeckii. So looks like it actually originated in the southern Rockies and then spread northwestward. But along the way, because of the difference in habitat and climate and isolation, it's speciated. And so we have a number of species that have been derived through this process of responding to opening and closing of passageways. Another example, doing something slightly different. So this one goes from North America eastwards. We've seen examples that are coming from, or westwards. We've seen examples that are coming from the west and then into North America. Another group that appears to have recently speciated are the Hylovation campanula. And so we've called them the Cordilleran campanula. This is a tree showing a number of those taxa. There's about 7 in that group. And this is their various distributions. And what we did for this is we did a mapping. We made paleo models based on historic climate records, based on the Herbarium locations. And what we did is basically inferred what their current distribution is. We tested to see if our model could predict where they are found, and it did a good job at that. And then basically hindcasted to what historic climate records would have been like. And so during the mid-Holocene, that was a very warm period. The distribution was potentially reduced from what it is now. And then 21,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum, all this is covered with ice, and so it blocks them out of there. But down south, in our region, it would have been a wonderful time to be a campanula during a glacial episode. And then during an interglacial, which is preceding the last glacial, a warm period, much similar to today, we can again see that they were isolated, but the coast again looks good. Pretty similar between these two images. And so then what we did is we said, okay, across that whole time period, where could the campanula have persisted the entire time? And we would call those refugia, or stable, suitable habitats. And so basically we have this coastal area. The South Cascades and the Olympic Mountains would have been awesome places. The Southern Rockies would have been great. And then up along the coast in Alaska would have been good throughout that entire time period. And what we see is that pattern fits our phylogeny. I'll get to that in a second, but it fits the distribution and diversity that we see. And what we then did is we took each individual taxon, all shown here, and said, okay, what's the climate envelope of that organism based on a number of climatic variables. And what we can see is where these dark dots are, that's within this climate of precipitation and temperature and everything else, where does this species, Lasiocarpa, fit? And what we can see is that some of them are falling out quite different from one another on this little map. And what that means is that each region has a different environment, and the campanula have responded to that and has potentially been a driver of their speciation. So not only coupled with being isolated, but having to adapt to that different environment. And so again, this is something that happened relatively recently, probably over the last few 100,000 years. And so these alpine plants can adapt relatively rapidly to changes. Another interesting thing is this is an example of a group that came in from Siberia, got stuck down here, underwent all this speciation, and then went back. And so then Lasiocarpa, this species here, has recolonized Russia from North America, even though that's where the whole lineage was derived from. So these analyses of history teaches us a lot about what these plants have done and can do. So basically, isolation has been a big driver in speciation as well as in population size and the potential for local extinctions, whether it was during a glacial or a warm period, an interglacial like now. There's been a lot of opportunities for adaptation, diversification, speciation, and the rise of endemic taxa. And so climate change and oscillations aren't necessarily bad, provides all these different opportunities. And that there were a number of different refugias we could see for both those taxa and a number of different migration routes, how they got to where they are. So basically, each species is responding to climate on its own terms. Whatever its dispersal capacity is, whatever it's got genetically to be able to adapt, if it's a polyploid, if it has numerous copies of different genes, or if it's not, but they all respond individually to that. In addition, this has likely led to a big reshuffling of alpine communities through time, which means that there's new biotic interactions. You've got new competitors, you've got new potential pollinators, and all kinds of things like that they have to deal with. And those are things that we're going to see in the future as well. And that's what we want to talk about here to close this out, is what is the potential future of these alpine plants that, again, these little sky islands up here, which are getting smaller, because everything is going to be moving up slow. And so how well has this history of evolution and diversification and isolation prepared them to respond to future changes? So you've undoubtedly seen something like this before. The climate is changing. And these are various scenarios of what could potentially happen. A really bad scenario, sort of a mollified scenario, and one that's kind of in the middle. But basically, it's getting warmer. And what does that mean following up on our previous figure for alpine plants? So we know from history that during cool times, alpine plants, it's a great time, go down low in elevation, fill all the valleys, populations get huge, there's a lot of genetic diversity, a lot of opportunity to adapt and speciate. But where we are right now is in one of these warm times when plants have already been moving upslope, they've already been getting smaller populations, losing genetic variation, and potentially having some local extinctions. Now, that's only going to get worse and worse, probably, as those little islands become smaller and smaller. So how can we actually examine this and think about what's going to happen? So just to hit that hard again, we have all kinds of evidence from tree line studies to glaciers receding to plants. Actually, in Glacier National Park, they did a study where they looked at 10 indicator taxa of alpine plant species, and 4 of them have decreased in abundance already. And so we're seeing these changes. Plants are responding already to the fact that now the alpine is a much smaller area of available habitats. So these are their options. They can move like they have in the past. They can adapt like they have in the past, or they don't. And the question is it going to be too fast for them to do these options? How big of a change is there going to be, and how rapid is it going to be? And the prediction is it's going to be pretty big, and it's going to be pretty rapid. So, spoiler there. But what we've done is tried to combine a genetic approach with a geographic approach with a modeling predictive approach to estimate the realm of possibilities of what could go on. And so what we do is we take herbaria data, or our own data that we've collected from the field, and we try to predict all the climatic variables that are important for each individual taxon, each individual species. And then there's a number of ways that you can do this through a niche modeling perspective. There's a lot of different models out there, and they all tell you a different story. And so the approach that we did was an ensemble approach. We chose 8 different models, and then we tested to see what they say the outcome would be, or how good they are at predicting the current distribution. And then we sort of combine all those results together, and we end up then predicting in the past what happened to these species. Can we predict the current one? If so, let's look at the past and see what happened to that taxon. What that past prediction does is it sets up a series of models of what should have happened to the plant that it should have responded genetically to. So there should be a signature of those models in the genome when we make a phylogeny of different individuals. So we can actually test how good our model is at predicting the past by using genetic data. And then if we feel like we can predict the current, and we feel like our genetic data confirms our model, then we're going to have confidence using all these different models that we can predict something in the future if we have a guideline of what that climate is going to be like. And so then we try to predict what's the potential outcome for the potential distribution of these taxa. So that's the approach that we're using. One other taxon that we've used this on is rhodiola, primarily looking at the species Rhodiola integrifolia, but it's broken into a few subspecies. One of them out here, there's one that only occurs in New Mexico, another one that's spread more broadly across the region. One actually only occurs over in the New York area and in the east. And then Rhodiola rhodantha is a relative of this, but it's the one that's an endemic species of the southern Rockies. And then there's also Rhodiola rosea, which if you're into ethnobotany and supplements and things like that, it's a cure-all. So it's a good, has a lot of pharmacological uses, basically. And so we use these taxa to try to estimate what would happen to alpine plants. And so what we did is then did the same thing as before. We predicted the past. So here's the warm period during the Holocene, the last glacial maximum, the last interglacial, and then tried to say, okay, where would the refugia have been? Where could these plants have persisted across that entire spectrum of 125,000 years? say those are areas where they could have persisted. And that sort of sets up our model. How many populations within this subdivision of this species should there have been? And then we can test it. And so then we used numerous markers to make a phylogeny. And one thing that struck us that came out of this is that there was a big ancestral split between the Southern Rockies, SRMR, the Southern Rocky Mountain Refugium, and then what we call the Beringia clade, which is basically north of the Southern Rockies, seems to be derived from this Alaska group. And so what we wanted to do then, because these are so climatically different areas, the Southern Rockies is much drier, is influenced by these tropical systems. We modeled just for this group to see if we could predict the past and then the future from that. And so when we did, we used these 8 different models. We got a good consensus, and this then allowed us to have confidence that, okay, we're predicting the current range right here, and basically these numbers are, the redder it is, the higher our confidence is that this is a potential place for this plant right now in this figure. And if it's blue or a lighter color, that means that it's maybe a marginal potential habitat, but not that great. And one thing with this is you have to remember that you're not predicting where the plant is. You're predicting where it could be. It has the right climate envelope. And so just because it's got the right climate envelope, maybe there's something preventing it from getting there. And then what we did is we tested it with our phylogeny. We felt comfortable that we got a good match between the genetic data and the geographic data. So then we forecast into the future to see what would happen under these 2 different models, the A1B and the A2 scenario, the bad and the not so bad scenario. And what these 2 show here on this side are the 2 different models, but basically the potential distribution in the year 2085 for this plant, which is quite different from what it is now. And what this shows on this side is how big of a change there is. So if it's blue, that means it's stable. There's no change. If it's red, that means that that's a good spot. That's going to be a much better spot in the future for this plant than it is now. And if it's yellow, gold, that means that's habitat that's currently available that will no longer be available. So the vast majority of the Rocky Mountain Floristic region, which this alpine plant occupies across that whole area, is going to be gone from its suitable habitat. Is it going to be able to move rapidly across this? Probably not, but it doesn't have to because it's already occupying most of it. So what it actually means is you lose, depending on these models, this one's a little less dire than this one, but you basically lose it from our area. The habitat's just no longer good. But it will persist up along the Arctic coast in Alaska. And so this is, 70 years out, but not looking good for this alpine plant. And then it's a question of how representative is this of the flora in general. And so what we're doing now is trying to do more of these to get an idea of how representative this type of study is. And in addition to just the climate, there's a lot of confounding factors that you have to deal with that are associated with climate change that are not in these models. So this is really like, what's the temperature, precipitation, growing season, whatever going to be like? But it doesn't take into account that there's rare taxa that have really narrow distributions that maybe are stuck because of competition or just simply because of history. They were isolated on an island and they can't get on. Also, fire regime changes. Fires are expected to really escalate, not only in the magnitude and the size of the fire, but how frequent it is. And so if fires are really frequent, plants can't recolonize the area. They'll just continually get burnt out. Also, there's going to be novel biotic interactions, potential competition, as well as shifts in phenology, so flowering time, which means that a flower might come out, the pollinator might not be there. A case for the Arctic is on Greenland. Flowers, typically the vegetation came out and the caribou followed it and would have something to eat during the breeding season and the calving season, and then now that's mismatched already, and so the calves, the reproductive cycle of the caribou has taken a dive because of just a mismatch in that. So these plants have a huge impact on other sort of downstream things that are going on. And And so what I want to look at is just give you a brief idea of what some of my students are working on and where we're going with this. This is a graduate student of mine, Sam Wershaw, who is interested in these island endemics. So here's Haida Gwaii, Vancouver Island, the Olympic Peninsula. And these are all taxa. He's looking at about 10 taxa that are rare, endemic, isolated to these islands. Can they get over here to the mainland? Well, they haven't. Instead, they're probably going to have to go upslope. Haida Gwaii is not a very high mountain range, but because of where it is, the Alpine extends down very low in elevation. So they're kind of safe, but I did already show you that picture where there's a lot of a forest there. And so that's really what's isolating them. So how will they respond? Same thing for those that are restricted to the southern portion of their range. So rather than climate, it's probably history that's impacting these guys. And so their population sizes are probably already small. They don't have a lot of options as to where they can go. Unlike that rhodiola, Alaska will be fine, even better than it is now. Another one is Trevor. He's working on the additional impact that fire might have on alpine taxa. He's looking at Saxifraga Austra Montana, which I've shown you. And this species is a great species because it occurs almost across this entire region, just not in the Sierras. But like I said, the Californians will keep that for themselves anyways in their Floristic province. But also, this is the area that's going to be largely impacted by changes in the fire regime. And this is also a plant that occurs at alpine and subalpine elevations. And so it's really good for seeing what would be he wants to ask the question of how is this plant going to change under climate? And then is the change even going to be worse given that a lot of this area is going to be burnt out? And so what we've been doing, well, up until now, what I've been doing is all these blue dots going around the Rocky Mountains and picking flowers. And all these green dots are dots where there's historic records in our herbaria as well as other herbaria. And all those orange triangles are where we have fire data. So there's been fires here, 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 here. And so primarily what I've been doing is collecting samples from places that didn't burn. And what he's going to do is he's going to go back and collect samples from places that did burn and see if he can find them. Because what I found when I was out collecting, if there was a burn, the plant wasn't there. And so it looks like fire has a dramatic impact on these populations, and that's only going to get worse. I have a number of undergrads who are working on different projects, trying to understand the systematics in this section of Saxifraga bronchialis, looking at Saxifraga tricuspidata, vespertina, or Taylori and vespertina, these students. And so most of the work that I do, or a lot of the work that I do, is student-associated, driven by students, and co-authored by students. And then there's a whole other side of just documenting the diversity that's out there. We're going out, we're going to Russia, we're going to the Arctic, we're going across the Rocky Mountain Floristic region, picking flowers and documenting what's there because a lot of places haven't been sampled botanically before, but in addition, we want to monitor that and see if there are changes. So first we have to get a baseline of what's there and then go back and see are these plants moving or lost. This is Barry Wendling, who's the collection manager in our herbarium, a previous master's student of mine. And Caleb is working on this documenting diversity, but he works on Gymnopolis, which, does anybody know what that is? It's a fungus. So we're also branching out into a bit of mycology. And so overall, the implications of this is a regional conservation perspective. Bear in mind that we need to document and monitor this. These plants have been impacted by climate, and that's going to be the main thing that's going to hit them. Loss of habitat, fragmentation, small populations. This is an area that's typically not affected by humans, and that's why it's a neat place to go. But indirectly, it certainly is. And that's going to lead to different biotic interactions, competition, and things like that. But on the bright side, these plants have dealt with climate change since their inception. And so they're resilient to that. The worst thing you can do is probably step on them, and then they'll be gone for sure. But we'll have to see, as these models are predicting, it's going to get worse for them, but we don't necessarily know what the outcome of that is. And so the alpine is less affected by humans. A lot of it's conserved as parks. Do like my little daughter here, take care of it. She is trying to feed this squirrel, but she's trying to feed it one of the capsules of the Saxifraga, so she's not giving it bread or something like that that might not be good for it. Instead, she's trying to give it what it wants. So the final note that I would make is if you are interested in alpine plants, the Comocultion chapter is in Bellingham of the Washington Native Plant Society, and this year we will be hosting the Alpine Days, which are going to be in the middle of August, and it will be up at Mount Baker. And there will be all kinds of field forays, field trips, hikes for all kinds of levels, whether they need to be wheelchair accessible, whether they're for kids, whether they're for experts, whatever. There's going to be a series of talks. I think it's a 3-day event with dinner and maybe some music and dancing. And so that hasn't been posted on their site yet, but it is coming. So that will be mid-August. Something to look forward to with the help